The quiet man in line, the terminal, buzzed with the usual mix of chaos and tired excitement. Families huddled together near gates. Solo travelers clutched their headphones, and business people checked their watches with quiet frustration. It was early morning at Heathrow Airport, and the lines were already stretching past the velvet ropes like vines twisting across old stone. In the middle of this crowd stood a man who didn't look rushed, angry, or impatient. He was dressed simply. Plain jeans, a black backpack, and a worn leather jacket that had clearly seen many countries. His hair was tied loosely at the back of his neck, and he kept his head slightly down as if trying not to be noticed. It was Keanu Reeves. He wasn't surrounded by bodyguards. He wasn't wearing designer labels or flaunting his status. Most people didn't even recognize him. He liked it that way. Airports had become his moments of peace, a strange quiet between worlds, where he could just be human. He was flying economy this time, even though his net worth could have bought every seat on the plane 10 times over. He didn't care for luxury. He cared for moments, for people, for observing life as it passed by. This trip wasn't for a movie or a red carpet. It was something personal, and it had to be done quietly. As he reached the check-in counter, the agent looked up, already irritated from the long shift. Her name tag read, Melissa. Her ponytail was tight, her smile was fake, and her attitude had grown sharper with every passing hour. Keanu offered a soft smile and said in his usual gentle voice, "Hi, I have a reservation under Reeves." She didn't look at him properly. "Passport." He handed it over politely. She opened it, paused for a moment, then looked up. Her eyes squinted, lips twisted in a smirk. "Reeves? Oh wow, you're that actor guy, huh?" He chuckled lightly, unsure how to respond. "Yeah, I guess." She leaned back in her chair with exaggerated flair, her voice loud enough for the person in line behind him to hear. "Wow, I didn't expect the Keanu Reeves to fly economy. Guess you're not as rich as people think." She said it with a fake laugh, but her words were like knives. "And that accent? What is that? Canadian mixed with surfer?" People in line began to glance over. One or two raised their eyebrows. Some looked amused. One woman even pulled out her phone hoping to catch a clip she could share on social media. Keanu's smile didn't fade, but something behind his eyes dimmed. He stayed calm. "I'm just here to catch a flight, ma'am." "Ma'am?" She repeated with mock offense. "Oh, so now I'm old too?" She laughed again, tapping at the keyboard lazily. Then came the real insult. "You know, I used to love your movies, when I was like 12. But you kind of faded, didn't you? Guess Hollywood moved on. Anyway, you're lucky I'm not charging you for the overweight bag." The man behind Keanu muttered under his breath. "Wow, some people just don't know when to shut up." Melissa rolled her eyes at that, but ignored him. She slapped the printed ticket on the counter with a grin that barely covered her spite. "Gate 43. Enjoy your flight, Mr. Hollywood." Keanu nodded slowly, picked up his ticket, and turned to leave. His face didn't show anger. It showed something heavier. Disappointment. Not in her, but in how often people let power make them cruel. As he walked away, a woman who had watched everything stepped out of line. She was dressed in a professional navy suit, tall and confident, with a calm expression. She approached the counter and leaned in slightly. "Do you know who that man is?" she asked quietly. Melissa smirked. "Yeah, some washed-up actor." The woman leaned in further. "He owns the majority share of Transcend Travel Group. They're about to announce a new global partnership with 3 major airlines." Melissa blinked. "So?" The woman straightened. "You just mocked a man who could decide the future of your entire airport?" Melissa's face paled slightly, but she tried to brush it off. "You're joking." The woman didn't reply. She simply walked away, following the same path Keanu had taken. But she wasn't just anyone. She was the regional director of one of the airline partners, and what she had just witnessed would not be forgotten. Meanwhile, Keanu had taken a seat near the gate, quiet and alone. He watched a little boy and his mother laugh over spilled juice. He smiled softly. Not everything needed to be loud or dramatic. Sometimes strength was in silence. But as his phone buzzed with a message from his assistant, he read the words slowly. Confirmed. Full ownership transfer of partnership shares set for today. Press release draft ready. Do you want to proceed? He looked up once more. Across the terminal, Melissa was still at the counter, now chuckling with another agent completely unaware. Keanu typed just 3 words. Let's do it. He pressed send and slipped the phone into his jacket. He wasn't trying to teach anyone a lesson, but sometimes the world teaches its own, quietly, powerfully, and without warning. When silence speaks louder than power, Keanu sat by the large terminal windows, watching planes glide across the morning sky like birds moving through distant dreams. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, but the soft glow of dawn painted the glass in shades of gold and silver. Most people wouldn't have known it, but he wasn't just another traveler waiting for his boarding call. He was a man who had learned the art of observing deeply, of understanding people without needing many words. What happened at the counter had unsettled him, not because he was offended, but because it was a reflection of something larger. Too many people judged others without knowing their story. Too many people used power to hurt, not realizing how fragile dignity could be when pushed too far. Yet for Keanu, it wasn't about revenge. He didn't believe in shouting or making a scene. He believed in quiet truths. But today something had shifted inside him, not because he was insulted, but because he had watched that young agent humiliate others before him too. An elderly couple confused by the kiosks, a teenager with a speech disorder who had asked for help and was met with laughter, and a janitor who accidentally crossed the boarding ropes and was scolded loudly in front of everyone. Keanu had seen it all. And that's what made him say, "Let's do it." While passengers moved through the terminal oblivious to the unfolding storm, a storm of a different kind was building behind the scenes. Across the globe, in a quiet office overlooking Singapore's harbor, a woman in a sleek black dress paced in front of a curved glass desk. Her name was Elena Park, the chief operating officer of Transcend Travel Group. She had worked with Keanu for years, not just as a business partner, but as someone who shared his values: dignity, humanity, and humility. The message she had received just minutes ago made her pause in her steps. Let's do it. Simple words. But coming from Keanu, they carried the weight of quiet resolve. Initiate the withdrawal? Her assistant asked, slightly nervous. She nodded without hesitation. Yes. Begin the immediate pullout of all ongoing airport contracts tied to the UK sector, starting with Heathrow. Freeze upcoming funding agreements, and I want the press release ready in the next hour. We'll announce at 11 a.m. their time. The assistant blinked. But we're talking about $950 million in active deals. Are you sure he wants? He's sure, Elena said softly, cutting him off. He's not the kind of man who acts out of ego. If he said do it, there's a reason deeper than what we see. In the terminal, Keanu's name was not whispered. His presence didn't send staff running. Yet soon, his quiet decisions would thunder louder than any voice. As he walked slowly through the duty-free area, he noticed a young man in a wheelchair, struggling with a jammed gate. Without a word, Keanu stepped forward, knelt beside the wheels, and helped unlock the mechanism gently. The boy looked up, stunned. Are you really Keanu Reeves? Keanu just smiled. What's your name? Devin. Well, Devin, he said as he helped him roll forward. You've got good taste in travel. I used to hate airports. When I was your age. You still do? Not when I get to meet people like you. A few nearby travelers watched the moment. One recorded it, not for fame, but because something about the kindness struck them. No announcements, no flash. Just a man helping another. As Keanu waved goodbye and continued walking toward his gate, the terminal's atmosphere seemed unchanged. But it was, like standing on the edge of a cliff right before the ground starts to give way. Upstairs in one of the premium lounges where major airline executives gathered between international hops, the first ripples had begun. A high-level manager from London's aviation authority was handed a confidential document, eyes widening as he read the subject line. Urgent withdrawal of investment. Transcend Group divests UK travel partnerships effective immediately. His voice rose before he could control it. What the hell is this? Another executive leaned in. They're pulling out? All of it? This week's partnership summit? Cancelled, the first man replied sharply. And it's not just cancelled, it's collapsed. Our biggest deal this quarter, gone. News spread like fire in dry grass. Within minutes, calls started flying across departments. Emails marked Priority 1 hit inboxes of directors, CEOs, and government liaisons. A few high-level employees began connecting dots faster than others. One whispered, "This has to be about the airport treatment. Didn't someone mention Keanu Reeves was here this morning?" At that exact moment, Melissa at the check-in counter was laughing again, joking with a coworker about how she handled Mr. Hollywood. She didn't see the look that passed between the airport supervisor and security as they slowly approached her terminal. She didn't notice how her name flashed across internal systems flagged for review, and she had no idea that multiple passengers had already sent complaints about her earlier behavior. Most notably, the woman in the navy suit. Keanu, still unaware of the chaos unfolding, had finally reached his gate. He sat quietly in the far corner, away from the noise, sipping warm tea someone had handed him as a gesture of appreciation for helping the boy earlier. He was thinking about the trip ahead. The place he was going held old memories, some beautiful, some painful. He wasn't seeking attention or headlines. He was seeking peace. But peace has its own way of drawing light. In a control room near Gate 43, the head of international relations at the airport received a final confirmation from Transcend's main office. The voice on the other end was calm but firm. This wasn't a business decision, she said. It was a human one. The call ended, and the woman placed the phone down gently. Her eyes turned toward the security camera footage of earlier, that morning. She watched as Keanu was mocked, humiliated, dismissed. She watched his patience, his kindness, his silence. Then she turned to her staff. I want the names of everyone who witnessed that moment. And I want that check-in agent's file on my desk in 10 minutes. Outside, people were still boarding flights, grabbing coffees, and rushing to gates. But behind the glossy walls and luxury lounges, a reckoning had begun. Not just for a single agent, but for an entire system that forgot what kindness looks like when it's quiet. Keanu leaned back in his chair, eyes closing for a moment. The plane hadn't left yet, but the real journey was already in motion. The file no one was supposed to open. The day began like any other for Melissa. She clocked into her shift at the check-in counter with a steaming cup of oversweetened coffee, fake lashes, and a half-bored expression that had become her trademark. She didn't notice the stiff glances her manager gave her as she walked past security. She didn't catch the way conversations quieted when she entered the break room. The shift schedule on the wall had a small, quiet change, an asterisk next to her name, blinking only for those who knew what it meant. Keanu Reeves had already boarded by then. He sat by the window seat, head resting gently against the cool pane, watching the wings of the plane tremble under the weight of morning winds. He wasn't thinking about the check-in incident. Not really. He was thinking about how strange the world could be, how often people wore masks of bitterness just to hide their own hurt. He'd learned that early in life. He'd seen fame do two things to people: make them feel invincible or make them invisible. He had chosen neither. He chose to stay human. But back on the ground, the wheels of accountability had already begun to turn, quietly, precisely, and without warning. In a small glass-walled office tucked behind the executive wing of the airport, Julian Hayes adjusted his tie with trembling fingers. He was the airport's director of personnel integrity, a role often overlooked unless things went very, very wrong. This morning, he had received 3 emails marked as Internal Priority Level 1, a classification that rarely appeared unless a lawsuit or federal investigation loomed. Each email linked to a different video clip recorded by passengers. All 3 clips showed the same moment from slightly different angles. Melissa mocking Keanu Reeves, And what disturbed him wasn't just the mockery, it was her smile, her joy in humiliation, her comfort in cruelty. He had seen employees reprimanded for worse, but never had he seen the reaction that followed: withdrawal of nearly $1 billion in investment from one of the world's most powerful travel corporations. It didn't take a genius to connect the dots. What did take courage, however, was to open the file now blinking on his encrypted terminal, the personnel file of Melissa R. Davenport. He opened it with a sigh, but what he saw inside froze him. There were multiple warning flags. Not just one. Not two. 6, all dated within the last 18 months. 6 separate complaints from passengers about inappropriate language, refusal of service, verbal harassment, and racial comments. Each time the file had been closed quickly, sometimes with only a single note. No action taken. Insufficient evidence. But that wasn't all. Julian clicked deeper. 3 internal reviews, 2 supervisors' notes recommending retraining, and 1 incident involving another staff member, filed as verbal intimidation on premises. He leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples. He hadn't seen this because it had been buried, moved between folders and marked low priority by someone else before him. But the pattern was clear. Melissa wasn't just careless. She had been protected. He picked up his phone and dialed the internal ethics auditor. "I need you in my office now." Meanwhile, across the terminal, Melissa continued working as if nothing had changed. But she felt something strange in the air. Her co-workers had grown quiet. No more morning gossip or shared jokes. Even the manager who usually stopped by to flirt looked tense. Still, she dismissed it. In her mind, she was untouchable. She believed no one really cared about customer complaints, especially when the customers were just random strangers or washed-up celebrities who didn't throw tantrums. But she hadn't accounted for one detail. That woman in the navy suit? Her name was Cassandra Lai, and she wasn't just a passenger. She was the legal compliance officer for Aero Alliance, one of the 3 airlines in direct negotiation with Transcend Travel Group. Her report, filed less than 30 minutes after leaving the check-in counter, contained screenshots, detailed observations, and a single closing line that would later be quoted on national news. If this is how Heathrow treats one of the most respected humanitarians and public figures of our generation, I question their integrity in any future partnerships with us. Keanu didn't know about the file, or Cassandra's report, or the chain reaction now spiraling through corporate offices in London, Singapore, and New York. He was simply trying to enjoy the view, replaying a voicemail his sister had left for him the night before. "I'm proud of you, Kay. You always do the right thing, even when it's hard." He smiled faintly, unaware that by the time the plane landed, the world behind him would already be on fire. In Julian's office, the ethics auditor, a tall, serious woman named Maya, stood silently as she reviewed Melissa's file, her brow furrowed deeper with every click. "You're telling me this was all buried?" she asked quietly. "Yes," Julian replied. "By one of her former supervisors. He resigned 6 weeks ago. We never thought to review the flagged cases." Maya didn't answer right away. Instead, she typed a few quick notes, then turned toward the door. "Send an internal memo." Effective immediately, she suspended pending investigation. On what grounds? Maya looked over her shoulder. On the grounds that she made the wrong man feel small, and the whole world is now watching. News outlets were starting to catch whispers of the collapse. Someone had leaked part of the withdrawal statement from Transcend. Rumors spread like wildfire. "Keanu Reeves triggers global travel shakeup," one headline read. Others began speculating the cause. None had the full story yet, but soon they would. And back at the airport, as Melissa returned from her break, she was handed an envelope by a tight-lipped supervisor. She opened it, eyes scanning the top line. "You are hereby placed on immediate administrative leave." The hallway around her felt suddenly colder. The laughter stopped. No one would meet her eyes. Meanwhile, in the sky high above the ocean, Keanu sat in peaceful silence, unaware that his simple dignity had become the spark that shook an empire. He didn't know about the media stories or the viral clips. He only knew that sometimes the best way to speak was to stay silent. But as the plane began its descent into Iceland, his destination, his phone buzzed gently with a message from Elena. It's begun. She's been removed. We've exposed everything. Keanu didn't reply right away. He looked out the window, the snowy mountains glimmering in the distance like ancient ghosts waiting to speak. He wasn't after justice. He wasn't after revenge, but perhaps, just perhaps, this time silence had done what noise never could. The secret buried beneath runway 7 outside. Snowflakes kissed the edge of the runway as Keanu's plane touched down on the icy land of Iceland. The winds swept across the airport like quiet ghosts, and inside the cabin, passengers stirred, blinking off sleep and fastening seatbelts. But Keanu remained still for a moment, gazing out at the jagged mountains in the distance. There was a strange kind of clarity and solitude, a cold silence that didn't bite, but rather spoke to the soul. He had come here for a private reason, a promise he had once made to someone he had lost. But life, as always, had brought something unexpected along the way. Now, as he stepped off the plane, he walked straight into a storm far more complicated than the cold winds outside. Back in London, the airport boardroom buzzed like a beehive cracked open. Papers shuffled, voices rose, and screens flickered with live feeds from legal teams, financial analysts, and security experts. Julian Hayes stood at the head of the table, sweat trickling under his collar, not because he feared losing his job, but because he feared what was about to be uncovered. The personnel audit that began with Melissa had led to something deeper, something older, and something no one in management wanted to admit out loud. In a separate room on the same floor, a young, investigative journalist named Reena Kumar sat with headphones on, her eyes locked on a tablet screen. Reena wasn't from the mainstream press. She worked for a small digital outlet known for uncovering stories others were too afraid to touch. She had gotten a tip from a former security guard, someone who had been fired after trying to report what he saw 2 years ago. And now, finally, the pieces were starting to come together. On the screen, Reena replayed a video again and again. The footage was grainy, taken from an old security camera at the staff entrance near runway 7. The date stamp was from 18 months ago. In the video, Melissa could be seen in a heated argument with another woman, an intern who had worked briefly in the customer service department. The argument escalated. There were no words in the footage, but body language told a powerful story. The intern looked upset, waving what appeared to be a printed document in her hand. Melissa tried to grab it. Then a man entered the frame, her supervisor at the time. He pulled the paper from the intern, said something sharply, and ushered her away. 2 days later, the intern was gone. No exit paperwork, no resignation letter. Just gone. Reena narrowed her eyes. She tapped her stylus on the edge of the tablet. Why would a supervisor get involved over a piece of paper? She muttered. And who protects a check-in agent with 6 flags on her record? She opened her notes. The name of the former supervisor, Daniel M. Lawson, a name that had appeared repeatedly in buried HR files tied to ignored complaints and closed investigations. Most people didn't remember Daniel. He had resigned quietly and moved abroad. But Reena did, and so did one other person, Elena Park. At that very moment, Elena was reviewing a second report from her private auditing team. It confirmed what she had feared. Daniel Lawson had not only buried complaints against Melissa, but he had also been involved in falsifying employee records for at least 3 other staff members, 2 of whom were now in senior positions within the airport. The problem wasn't just one rude employee. It was a pattern of protection, intimidation, and cover-ups, woven into the airport's foundation like rot in the walls of a grand estate. She forwarded the file to Keanu. When his phone buzzed, he was sitting alone in a wooden cabin overlooking a frozen lake, sipping hot tea from a cracked ceramic cup. The snow outside fell in thick sheets, softening the sound of the world. He opened the file and read in silence, his face unreadable. But something in his posture shifted, a quiet steel forming in his shoulders. He called Elena. This goes deeper than we thought, he said softly. Yes, and we're just scratching the surface. What about the intern? The one from the footage? We don't know yet. No trace in the employee exit records. She was wiped clean. Keanu stared out, at the snow, lost in thought. Find her. Meanwhile, Rena pushed deeper. Using encrypted databases and leaked internal directories, she discovered the intern's name, Sophie Amari. She had been 22 at the time, a graduate intern in international relations. Her background check had been clean. Her performance, reviews glowing. Then, without warning, she disappeared from the system. No HR note, no payroll closeout. Nothing. Rena leaned back in her chair. Someone erased her. Her next step was bold, but necessary. She reached out to Cassandra Lee, the airline legal officer who had witnessed Melissa's behavior firsthand. Cassandra, now back in Singapore, agreed to a confidential video call. What began as a formal interview turned into a shared mission. Cassandra shared internal records from Aero Alliance, emails between Daniel Lawson and a shadow partner known only as P. These emails hinted at more than protection. They hinted at an illicit deal. Certain staff paid under the table to ensure specific passengers were delayed, rerouted, or discreetly turned away. Gate manipulation, Cassandra said quietly. It's rare, but it happens, mostly for political or corporate reasons. Or worse, Rena added, to hide something. A new theory began to form. What if Sophie had uncovered a passenger manipulation scheme? What if that paper she held in the video was a record of a diverted flight that wasn't supposed to be seen? As the truth thickened, the airport's executive board met in an emergency night session. Julian presented the files. Maya delivered the findings. And one by one, high-ranking staff began to fall under investigation. What had started as a mockery of one man's accent was now unraveling into a full-blown scandal. And through it all, Keanu remained calm. His silence, his refusal to retaliate publicly, had spoken more powerfully than any press conference. He wasn't after revenge. But he would not ignore corruption either. He had become the mirror that forced the airport and the world to see itself clearly. As the night deepened in Iceland, his phone rang again. This time it was Elena. We found her, she said. Sophie Amari, she's alive. And she wants to talk. Keanu took a long breath. Then let's hear her story. The file that could burn nations when Sophie Amari agreed to speak. The world around her shifted. For nearly 2 years she had lived quietly in the north of Wales under a different name, working in a second-hand bookstore tucked between stone alleyways. She had no social media, no forwarding address, and barely trusted anyone who asked too many questions. Her disappearance from the airport records hadn't been her choice. It had been forced on her. And until now, she had believed that silence was her only form of safety. But when she received a message from Elena Park, delivered through encrypted networks and verified by the same journalist who had once interviewed her for an internship, she knew the day had come. She couldn't hide forever. And the world needed to know what was buried in her past. The video call took place in a private cabin near the edge of the lake in Iceland. Elena, Rena, and Keanu were all present. No assistants, no recording. Just ears and eyes that had vowed to listen. Sophie appeared on the screen, her face older than her age, her eyes carrying a quiet storm. She didn't greet anyone. She didn't ask how they found her. She simply began speaking, her voice trembling but clear. I was assigned to a low-level desk in internal routing. Nothing special. But 3 weeks in, I started noticing patterns. A few passengers, always high profile, always last minute, were being rerouted through private customs entries, sometimes for security reasons, they said. But the logs didn't match. Some of them weren't even on official flight manifests. Keanu listened carefully, his fingers laced under his chin. Rena began typing silently. Elena stayed quiet, letting the young woman speak her truth uninterrupted. I cross-checked one entry with immigration records, Sophie continued. The passenger never entered the country. There was no stamp, no footage, just a name that didn't exist. And when I brought it to Daniel Lawson, my supervisor at the time, he told me to delete the inquiry. He said it was above our grade. I pushed. I asked who signed the routing. That's when everything changed. She paused, swallowing hard. 2 days later, I was called to HR. They accused me of accessing restricted files. They said I breached protocol. But there was no hearing, no warning, just a contract termination and a threat. Walk away quietly, and you'll be left alone, they told me. Fight this and we'll make sure no one believes a word you say. Elena narrowed her eyes. Was the file you held in the video, was that the routing log? Sophie nodded. Yes. It showed that a passenger with no identity was routed through Gate 7, but the flight he came on didn't exist in public schedules. It had no commercial ID. It was a ghost flight. Rena stopped typing. Where did it come from? Keanu asked softly. Turkmenistan. That word hung in the air like smoke. Sophie took a shaky breath. I did some digging, quietly. The flight was tied to a shell company registered in Cyprus, and that company had connections to several international lobbying firms and one private intelligence contractor. I didn't know what I was looking at. I just knew it was wrong, and that Melissa, she wasn't just rude, she was involved. I overheard her taking a call the day before my file was pulled. She said, "He lands at dawn, the path's clear." I wrote it down. I still have the notebook. You kept it? Rena asked. Sophie reached behind her, held up a faded red notebook with torn corners. It's all here. Every name, every anomaly, every signature Daniel Lawson forged to cover the rerouting. I didn't know who to trust. So I left. For a moment, no one spoke. Keanu leaned back, looking toward the window. The snow was still falling outside, and the lake beyond looked like a frozen mirror, holding the secrets of 100 worlds beneath its surface. Finally, he spoke. What do you want us to do? Sophie hesitated. I want to disappear again. But before I do, I want the truth out. I want them to know what they did. And I want to make sure no intern ever has to go through what I did just for doing the right thing. Elena nodded. We'll protect you. And with that, the wheels of revelation began to turn. The next 24 hours were a storm of secrecy and strategy. Keanu called in favors, not from politicians or celebrities, but from human rights organizations he had quietly supported for years. Elena worked with international legal experts to ensure Sophie's testimony and documents could be handled without compromising her safety. Rena prepared a long-form exposé, backed by facts, scanned documents, and cross-verified sources. It would not be a tabloid piece. It would be the kind of journalism that could not be ignored. Back in London, the airport's board was now under lockdown. Media inquiries flooded their lines. Investors began pulling out. Even government transportation officials requested emergency briefings. When the press caught wind of an intern's hidden file, the narrative changed instantly. Intern vanished after uncovering flight anomaly tied to foreign shell company. Ghost flights at Heathrow. Whistleblower steps forward. Keanu Reeves breaks silence after airport scandal. This isn't just about me. The headlines echoed across every major news outlet. Social media turned from curiosity to outrage. But in the heart of it all, Keanu remained measured, controlled. He had always believed the world could change without shouting, but now he was ready to speak, not in anger, but in truth. He prepared a statement. The setting was humble. A quiet bench by the frozen lake in Iceland, a handheld camera, and the natural light of a gray morning. No production team, no script, just him. He began with these words. A few days ago, someone laughed at my accent. They thought that was the story. But the real story is about someone else. A young woman who was silenced for asking a question. This isn't about fame. This isn't about pride. This is about how we treat people when no one is watching, and what we do when we finally realize we've watched for too long. Within hours, the video was watched by millions. Not because it was loud, but because it was honest. And in the shadows of the airport's grand corridors, Melissa, now suspended and facing formal charges of misconduct and conspiracy, watched it too. Her hands trembled as she realized that her smirks, her jokes, her careless cruelty, had finally reached their end. But the story wasn't over. Because deep within the network of names Sophie had uncovered, there was still one more player, known only as P. A silent figure who had signed off on every ghost flight, and Rena had just found a clue that could unmask them. The man behind the curtain. The snow was melting. In Iceland, spring did not arrive with fanfare but with small, steady signs, a patch of brown earth beneath a tree, the return of bird calls at dawn, the quiet drip of ice surrendering its grip on stone. And just as nature began to reveal what winter had hidden, so too did the truth, finally rising to the surface after years of silence. Keanu Reeves stood alone on the cliff's edge overlooking the thawing lake, not as an actor or a businessman, but as a man who had chosen not to look away. Behind him, the world was bracing itself for what was coming. Because now, the identity of the mysterious figure known only as P was no longer a secret. It started with a single forgotten email, buried deep within a batch of archived legal documents Cassandra Lee had pulled from her Aero Alliance database. Most of it was encrypted or scrubbed clean, but one file had slipped through, a PDF dated nearly 3 years back, attached to a proposal for joint private lounge access at Select E. International hubs. Rena Kumar, ever meticulous, scanned the metadata. The digital signature wasn't from any of the listed executives. It was a ghost account linked to a man who had once served as deputy director for international airport operations. His name was Philip Warburton. On paper, Philip had retired early. He had left with honors, praised for building diplomatic ties between airlines and overseas governments. But Rena's digging found something darker. After his retirement, he had quietly become a private consultant, off the record, for Shell, companies linked to restricted air corridors and silent routes, often used by officials who didn't want their movements documented. And he had one more connection. He had personally recruited Daniel Lawson over a decade ago. Now, the puzzle fit too well to ignore. Alina sent the findings to international oversight bodies. Sophie's notes confirmed that Warburton had authorized 3 of the ghost flights directly. Cassandra backed it with cross-referenced routing codes that had passed through Gate 7. Every single one manually cleared by a custom override only someone at Warburton's level could access. When confronted with the evidence, Warburton didn't deny it. Instead, he disappeared. His home in Marseille was abandoned within hours of the inquiry. His digital trail went cold. But this time, he wasn't dealing with a single intern or a silenced whistleblower. He was facing a global storm powered by people who refused to be quiet anymore. By the end of the week, Interpol had issued an alert. Private investigators working alongside human rights attorneys traced a travel pattern that suggested Warburton had flown to Turkey, then likely crossed the border into Georgia. It was the move of a man who had practiced escape routes for years. Meanwhile, back in London, the airport that had once laughed at a quiet man's accent was now in full reform. Melissa was terminated permanently, pending civil lawsuits from multiple victims, including passengers she had harmed long before Keanu's visit. Daniel Lawson was arrested at his villa in southern Italy, extradited to the UK on charges of conspiracy, document tampering, and obstruction of justice. And the executive board of the airport issued a public apology, not just to Keanu Reeves, but to Sophie Amari, who had been invited to speak in front of a parliamentary hearing about whistleblower protection laws. She declined the spotlight. Instead, she sent a letter, handwritten in the same red notebook she had once guarded with her life. It was read aloud in the courtroom. I never wanted fame. I never wanted revenge. I only wanted someone to believe me. And now that someone did, I can finally sleep in peace. The room was silent as her words echoed across the chamber. Keanu, from afar, watched the proceedings quietly. He had returned to Los Angeles by then, having completed his private trip in Iceland, the one that had taken him to the grave of an old friend who once told him, "The only thing that changes the world is how we treat the people no one else notices." That friend had been a stagehand, a man with no awards, no red carpets, but his kindness had shaped Keanu's soul more deeply than any film ever could. Now, as the media frenzy died down and the headlines moved on, Keanu did not. He took the money that would have gone into the now cancelled UK partnerships, nearly $950 million, and repurposed it into something entirely unexpected. Together with Alina, Rena, Sophie, and Cassandra, he launched a global initiative called Gatekeepers, a non-profit dedicated to exposing airport corruption, protecting frontline workers, and building ethical accountability into the international travel industry. The first airport to sign on for full reform with Gatekeepers oversight? Heathrow. The irony did not escape anyone. The launch was held not in a grand ballroom but outside, under the open sky of Singapore's Marina Park. Keanu spoke last, standing on a simple wooden stage surrounded by hundreds of travel workers, journalists, and advocates. "This didn't start with me," he said softly. "It started with one woman who saw something wrong and chose not to look away. It grew because people listened instead of laughed. It mattered because silence, when shared, becomes strength." A standing ovation followed. Not because of who he was, but because of what he had chosen to stand for. Melissa, now alone and facing public scrutiny, watched from a small television in her lawyer's waiting room. No longer shielded by silence or protected by power, she saw what true strength looked like. It wasn't in mocking others or hiding behind ranks. It was in dignity, in kindness, in those who chose to lift others instead of stepping on them. In the final weeks of the investigation, a final file surfaced, an email from Philip Warburton to a private contractor in the Middle East. It read, "Use the override, route him through Gate 7, tell Melissa to keep her mouth shut." And with that single sentence, the last thread of the cover-up unraveled. The international community pressed harder. Warburton was eventually captured crossing into Armenia, turned over to authorities under diplomatic agreement. When the news reached Sophie, she cried for the first time in years, not because he was caught, but because her truth had finally been heard. And Keanu, he continued living the way he always had, quietly, kindly, without fanfare. But this time, wherever he traveled, airport staff would stop him not for photos or autographs, but to shake his hand and whisper, "Thank you." And still, when asked in a later interview what drove him to act, he simply smiled and said, "Because someone laughed at a stranger's accent." And the world forgot that behind every voice there's a story that matters.